For a game called Magic, there are a great many strategies we play that don't feel very magical at all. You have token decks picking up wins with a mobilized army, Voltron players kicking in your teeth directly, and aristocrats decks throwing more bodies at their problems than spells. But what if that's not your style? What if you really are a wizard at heart? You want to reach out your hand and feel lightning spring forth from your fingertips, call down fireballs and ice storms, outwit the other players, and overwhelm them with raw magical prowess. Or maybe you're more gameplay-minded. You want to take out opponents by surprise. Instead of telegraphing a gradual, grindy victory and opening yourself up to being stopped, you'd prefer to secretly assemble your win in your hand, and then deploy it all at once in a flurry of game actions, closing the curtain on the game before anyone knows they've lost. Whether the reason is for flavor or for function, you've decided you want to try delving into the world of Spellslingers, and you're certainly not alone. This is a beloved and well-established archetype that shows up all over the game's formats. There's multiple forms of Burn and Pauper, Delver and Legacy, and Vivi conquered Standard for a while recently. And of course, this strategy has come over to Commander as well. Technically, any deck focused on instants and sorceries might be considered Spellslingers, but today we're going to be discussing its most iconic form, a deck centered around casting a large quantity of instants and sorceries. Big spells matter, this is not. Alright, here's the game plan. Magic has a lot of different effects that give us great benefits for casting instants or sorceries. To leverage these for maximum effect, we're going to be loading up on cheap instants and sorceries, which we can deploy many of on one turn to get a flurry of triggers. Okay, this sounds solid on paper, but how do we get there? We're going to break this strategy down into its critical components, and in my mind, for Spellslingers, those are payoffs, spells, and resource generation. At this point, you and Norman have a weekly game night where he agrees to help you test out all these new deck ideas. He's sitting across from you with a grindy mid-range deck, and he's got a couple value creatures in play. You decide it's time to do something about that problematic board of his, and so we're going to be dumping a bunch of spells right now. After a couple of good kills, and maybe some top deck adjusting, Norman has been set back a decent bit. But now you're out of cards with little to show for it in the way of a board. If this stays this way, Norman is going to redevelop and start outpacing us. And even if he doesn't, the other two players will. So, what do we do about this? The issue here is that cheap instants and sorceries are limited in impact. You're not going to be able to ruinate the board for 2 mana outside of very specific circumstances. To increase the impact of these cards, we need payoffs. For the sake of this discussion, payoffs are going to be any effect that triggers off of an instant or sorcery being cast, that pushes us closer to a win. Cards like Gutter Snipe are what we're looking for. Every time you cast an instant or sorcery, he's going to burn each opponent for 2 damage. It's as if he saw your brainstorm and decided there was going to be a sweet deal where he throws in 3 additional shocks free of charge. I don't think I need to tell you that this is going to vastly increase the impact of your plays. There's another quirk here that you may have noticed though, and that's that Gutter Snipe does not care what the mana cost of the spell was. You could lightning bolt someone for 1 mana, or open up a mortgage to afford a worst fears, and either way, Gutter Snipe will fork up the exact same payment. This will be important to remember for later in the spells section, but for right now, it helps us select which payoffs will go furthest with the least investment. On the flip side, we have Metallurgic Summonings. For 5 whole mana, you're getting a payoff which makes you tokens that scale with how expensive the spell you cast was. This means if we're playing 1 mana spells, it will only give us 1/1s. Compare this to Talrand's Sky Summoner. He's 1 mana cheaper, and the tokens he makes are twice as big, and they have flying. Metallurgic is not garbage, and it used to be a staple of the archetype, but as cards come out, we've gradually found payoffs that are either cheaper or have more impact. So, let's talk about some of the top performers. Your 2 main ways of winning are going to be through token generation or burn. For the former, Talrand was already mentioned and he's an all-timer. Big tokens, flying blockers, decent mana point. Young Pyromancer gets you 1/1s, but at a much more affordable rate than Metallurgic Summonings. Third Path Iconoclast does the same, but his cost is a bit more restrictive. In exchange, you get triggers on any non-creatures you cast, meaning your mana rocks and some of your other pieces of setup are going to trigger him as well. Eris is one of the bigger powerhouses I've ever had to face down. She often comes out for hardly any mana and then proceeds to make massive 4/4 flying dragons that have prowess, so she quickly wraps up games. My personal favorite, though, has to be Monastery Mentor. He triggers from all non-creatures again, but the monks he makes have prowess, so they're capable of getting huge in the event that you storm off down the line. On the burn side of things now, of course we have Gutter Snipe. 2 damage a spell is pretty high compared to some of the alternatives. Continuing down the line, Black Waltz number 3 does an impression of the Snipe, but he also provides a flying body to chip in for damage on his own. Coruscation Mage is quickly growing on me. He lets you decide whether you want a cheap early game burn effect or a more expensive one that deals more damage. Long Shot is both a mana reducer and a Gutter Snipe, and Vivior Nidier is, Jesus, what doesn't he do? Damage on top of mana and making himself huge. In keeping with Vivi and Black Waltz, the Black Mage tokens from the Final Fantasy set can be devastating. They add up quickly, and they make your opponent's removal feel really bad, since, it's a token they're killing. Okay, back to the game with Norman. He's sitting pretty in his position from before, but this time, you have a couple of payoffs on your side of the field. One makes tokens, one burns people. Alright, now let's dump that hand and watch the fireworks. After the dust settles, Norman's taken some casualties, a load of damage, and you're left with a collection of little guys to block with. Looking good on board, but unfortunately your hand is still empty. Now we're chancing the game on a couple of powerful draws from the top of the deck, rather than having it prepped and ready for next turn. This is the kind of environment a mid-range deck loves to be in, and it's not unlikely that Norman is going to recuperate before turning his aggro our way. So what's our problem here? Well, it's a simple matter of resources. Norman's strategy relies on permanents that give him reusable value every turn. Instants and sorceries can be really potent once, but the majority of the time they're not gaining you reusable value. By definition, when you cast cards with these types, they're going to leave as they resolve. I'm sure there are some actualies being typed up in the comments right now, but the instants and sorceries that can be reused are oftentimes incredibly expensive or require other significant costs. This runs counter to the goal of our strategy in the first place, that being casting many cheap spells. Instead, we need ways of refunding ourselves the resources we're expending. That's where resource generators come in. They can reimburse us cards and mana as we cast spells. Of the 2 of these, lacking cards is the first problem we run into, so let's cover that first. The ideal generator is one like this, Archmage Emeritus. Every single time we cast or copy an instant or sorcery, we're going to draw a card. This absolutely rules. Suddenly, all of these card types in our deck are replacing themselves as we cast them. You can start churning through the entirety of your library one card after another, assuming you don't get gummed up with a bunch of lands, of course. Archmage of Runes is similar to Emeritus, but also throws in a mana discounter for your investment. Unfortunately, this effect is in short supply, so oftentimes we have to find different avenues for card draw. Of course, you can just run a large amount of generic card advantage, and that works, but I have a personal recommendation. Many decks in this vein will be creating a ton of tokens. If that's the case for yours, Bident of Thassa effects are amazing. These draw you a card for every creature you control that connects with another player's face. These can often draw you more cards than you could feasibly cast in one turn, especially if your commander is a source of token generation. And, unlike with cast draw, we have redundancy here in spades. Coastal Piracy, Reconnaissance Mission, Enduring Curiosity, Kindred Discovery, a whole slew of these. If every time you cast an instant or sorcery, you make a creature, and every time they hit face, you draw a card, that makes every instant and sorcery you cast a reusable card advantage engine. This is a great avenue for drawing cards. Okay, tangent over. When we draw this many cards, mana then becomes the limiting factor. You can have all the spells in the world, but if you can't cast them, then no triggers for you. This is where Storm-Kiln Artist comes in. He's Archmage Emeritus' brother on the other side of the aisle. Every instant or sorcery gets you an untapped treasure token. The treasures crack open for a mana of any color, and can be stored for later turns if you don't want to use them now. I promise you, this plays so much better than it reads, and it is a must-kill threat. If the majority of your spells are 1 mana, then he just made them completely free, and he stops you from having to care about color requirements, just by existing on your board. Birgi, God of Storytelling, does a similar job here, but only makes red mana and it can't be stored for later. I feel like I'm getting deja vu here. Again, this is a great effect in short supply, so you can supplement it with either generic ramp or go the archetype specific route. There are cards that read, instants and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less mana to cast, and these are great for storming off. Bringing 2 and 3 mana cards down to 1 will put you in a position to go completely bonkers and cast a billion spells. And, just like the Bident effects, we've got a lot of redundancy here. Goblin Electromancer, Ral, Stormcatch Mentor, Thunderclap Drake, Baral Chief of Compliance. All of them get you into Discount Town. Be cautious though, There's an issue where these do not reduce colored mana requirements, so for each subsequent reducer you resolve, you get diminishing returns. Ideally, you want a mix of both generic and reduction ramp for this reason. Alright, let's take it from the top. You and Norman. He's got an engine and a couple creatures. You've got a hand, some burn payoffs, Archmage Emeritus, and a Storm-Kiln Artist. Here we go, the big turn. You go through a ton of cards, make a bunch of mana, and shred his life total down while still keeping a decent grip. At this point, the spells you're casting are largely incidental. As long as they say instant or sorcery in the text box, we're golden. But this opens up an opportunity to optimize what those individual spells are. When picking the spells for your deck, there's a split in philosophy. Do you shore up the times your engine does not come together, or do you double down on the times it does? If you play into the former, your deck will be primarily blue, and if it's the latter, you're probably going to be mostly red. Let's start with the safer strategy. Blue gets access to lots and lots of great cantrips. They're mostly 1 to 3 mana and either replace themselves or let you look a few cards into your library and pick a card to put into your hand. These cards increase the consistency of storming off on the turns that you have your engine together, and give you ways to dig for the pieces in the event that you don't. Brainstorm, Opt, Consider, Serum Visions, Cataxium Probe, Impulse, Anticipate, and Brain Surge are all popular examples of this in action. The individual spells have low impact, so you're leaning into the engine pieces to finish off the game. The opposite, riskier strategy is when you decide to play higher impact cards that do not reimburse themselves. You still go for cheap spells, but the ones that already do work on their own. This lets you have incredibly explosive games, but also risks putting yourself into a position where you're sitting there with a hand that simply won't budge. Lightning Bolt, Price of Progress, Amphibian Downpour, Grape Shot, Gut Shot, Bolt Wave, and Brimstone Volley all bring you closer to closing a game out or harm someone else's board. These spells have high impact and can close out games faster, but without the engine, you're going to burn through your resources. And then there's the spells that cut down the middle, damage and cards. Flame of Anor and Slick Sequence headline a new wave of spells that can go either way. They're also fittingly both colors, which I think is fun. The majority of these tend to cost a lot of mana though, so be careful you're not getting too clunky. The final answer of what you should play is dependent on personal preference, your commander, and what you're playing against. So, I advise you to experiment with the instants and sorceries in the deck to find out what combination you like best. And speaking of the commander, you'd be remiss not to factor them into this deal. They're the only thing that you can rely on every game, so having them take care of vital engine needs is really helpful. Kykar is an infamous headliner here. He's essentially a Storm-Kiln Artist since he can bank mana and the spirits he creates. He also puts you in some of the best colors for the strategy, and those spirits are flying so they trigger Bident effects super easily, or just chip in for damage. If Kykar is a Storm-Kiln, then Niv-Mizzet Perun is an Archmage Emeritus. He draws you cards for each instant and sorcery that get cast. Instead of making tokens though, he makes burn damage happen, letting you ping problematic creatures before moving on to lowering life totals. If you want to lean into massive tokens, Eris, Roar of the Storm will get you there. We talked about her a little bit before, but the dragons she makes will live on even if she doesn't. And she has a built-in discount mechanic to fight commander attacks. Stella Lee helps you keep moving through your cards, and leans into the riskier strategy by incentivizing you to copy Bolt Waves and other high-impact plays. Kess actually contributes to the number of instants and sorceries you can cast by giving you access to your graveyard cards. And Vivi is incredibly cheap for how he's a great payoff that also generates mana. This archetype has a lot of fantastic options, so this list is nowhere near the end-all be-all. These are just commanders with great examples of traditional Spellslinger values. Before we wrap things up here, I have a few miscellaneous thoughts that I want to put out there that don't fit nicely into any of the previous sections. Just like how Aristocrats is a heavily black strategy, Spellslingers is very invested in red and blue. They get the best cantrips, the best burn spells, the best payoffs, and the most supportive commanders. This strategy is absolutely possible in other colors. In fact, even Golgari has a weird amount of support now from Strixhaven. But just be aware that it gets easier when red and blue are in the mix. Mostly advice for newer wizards. Spellslingers actually have a lot in common with Aristocrats, namely, setup and payoff with multiple piece engines that need to be assembled or the deck falls flat. Spellslingers is less fragile in this regard, requiring fewer pieces and with cards that individually do more in the case that the engine doesn't assemble. But we significantly lack something Aristocrats gets access to: disposable resources. Aristocrats can make creature tokens, which don't require being sacrificed on a one card to one creature basis. We don't get an equivalent. There's no instant or sorcery tokens. Copying spells is similar, but it's expensive, and you don't get cast triggers when you do that. In this strategy, upping the number of spells we can cast is directly tied to how many cards we draw. Be aware of that. You need to draw more cards than other decks do. Here's another thing. Removal rules here. A lot of the most efficient removal is going to be cheap instants or sorceries by default. Swords to Plowshares is a good card without feeding you resources and burning your opponents. Even more so when it does. Sometimes, you can even end up winning by fighting a counter war with yourself, using a bunch of cheap counterspells on each other just for the triggers you're getting. Lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't warn you about this deck's social issues. Spellslingers has a reputation for two things: taking long turns and winning suddenly without telegraphing it beforehand. For the former, it's just going to be a case of learning to take actions faster. Getting more reps in with the deck will help you learn how to resolve things without needing to slow down and think about it too hard. You may think having your opponents concede would be an easy solve for this, but unfortunately, this is not a combo strategy. Oftentimes, our big bad turns are what we call non-deterministic. You are not guaranteed to win, just very likely. There's a possibility of whiffing, which means it's tough to shortcut to the end of the game. Also, some people just really don't like conceding, so it's not always an option. To speed up gameplay, it's important to take some time to practice on your own. So goldfish, goldfish, goldfish. The other problem is harder to avoid. Winning out of nowhere is going to happen. The deck assembles a couple of game pieces that, to the uninformed, are much more innocuous than your average green deck. Your threats fly under the radar. In addition to this, Spellslingers decks assemble their win in the hand. You'll stock up on cantrips and burn spells while you prep yourself to storm off. Notably, this all happens in a hidden zone, so it's difficult not to blindside people with your wins. If this is a problem for you or your group, I have two remedies. The first one is that there are ways to move towards that win more slowly. I would recommend leaning away from the direct burn payoffs like Guttersnipe and towards the token generating ones. Those tokens need to make it to your untap in order to attack, and pumping them up with prowess or non-green overruns presents another point of interaction for the table. This opens up more opportunities for counterplay. My Kykar deck feels 10 times more appropriate for my table after this change. The other option here is to embrace it. Acknowledge that working directly from a hidden zone is just a strength of Spellslingers. If this strength makes it so that you're winning an outsized portion of your games, you can always communicate. Tell your group in no uncertain terms that your deck does not intend to telegraph when it will win, and that they should start accounting for what may be in your hand instead of always just reacting to what's on your board. If that works out, then great. They're better players now, and you have a challenge. If you're still crushing the table, then consider that the deck itself may just be too strong for the bracket or pod you're playing in. There's nothing wrong with setting a deck aside for more intense games. I talk about these precautions because there's a tendency for Spellslingers players to go through a cycle, one that starts with getting really interested in a non-combat deck. Then building one, realizing it's very strong and can monopolize time, then finally taking it apart because they feel guilty for playing it. My advice, do not do this. If you genuinely enjoy an archetype, there's a good chance you can make it something that's healthy for your playgroup if you tinker around with it enough. Last year, I almost tore my Kykar deck apart for winning too many games, but now it's probably my favorite deck, period. It took some work, a couple revamps, some replacements, and saying goodbye to Perforos, but now I have the Jeskai deck I always wanted. And I think that's the takeaway. We play these decks because we love them, because we want to be the wizard, nose deep in a spellbook throwing lightning from their sleeve, the shaman standing on a mountaintop calling a hail of fire from the sky. Everyone playing this game is technically casting spells, sure, but here, in this deck, this is where you're really doing magic. So, if that sounds like what you're looking for, then maybe sleeve up a Storm-Kiln Artist sometime and jump into a Spellslinger deck. If you think I missed something, or have a favorite Spellslinger commander you'd like to share, please let me know in the comments below. I love getting a sense for what's out there beyond my experience, so help me be a better player with your advice. If you enjoyed the video, I would appreciate it if you liked it and shared it with a friend. It helps more than you can imagine as I try to grow this little channel of mine. If you enjoy the format of these videos, subscribe to the channel to be in the loop when I upload. I have a Discord where I get together with my subscribers and have game nights. And lastly, I've got a Blue Sky. Follow me there to see me harass other YouTubers. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.